Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. We love to do these, really dig into the listener's sources, and today's all about the history of psychology.
It's going to be a fun one.
It is, and especially how we even got to thinking about thinking.
Right, like how do we understand learning itself?
Exactly. So, we've got your sources here, and we've pulled out 3 major schools of thought that we're going to kind of hit as our big stops on this journey.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to put it, because it really is a journey when you look at how psychology developed.
Yeah, so we're talking European functionalism, Freudianism, and then behaviorism.
Big names.
Big names, big ideas, Piaget, Freud, and even like a whole bunch of people who kind of took Freud's ideas and ran with them in all sorts of directions.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and then this guy, John B. Watson, who really wanted to like flip psychology on its head.
Yeah, he had some strong opinions.
He did. So should we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so European functionalism, now you usually hear about the American version, but there was this whole movement happening over in Europe, particularly in Geneva, with Claparède and Piaget.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about the European approach is that they weren't just focused on breaking down these functions of the mind.
Yeah.
Like memory or attention or things like that.
Right.
They were really interested in how those functions developed over a person's life.
Oh, I like that.
So it's a much more dynamic view, I think.
Yeah, and speaking of dynamic, Claparède was all about this idea of the need as like the driver of mental activity.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, he actually said, we do not live to think, we think to live.
Wow.
Right?
That's powerful.
It's kind of profound when you think about it. Like it really puts things in perspective.
I mean, he's really saying that our brains aren't just for show, right?
Exactly.
Man? Like we think to live like we think because we need to navigate the world and get things done.
Yeah, solve problems.
Exactly. And that's a really different way of looking at things than maybe some of the other schools of thought that were around at the time.
Yeah, and that idea really influenced his colleague Jean Piaget, who some people say was the most important psychologist of the entire 20th century.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's big shoes to fill.
That's a huge legacy, right?
Right. Piaget came up with this idea of genetic epistemology. That sounds a little intimidating.
It does sound a little intimidating.
It's a mouthful.
But it's actually a really cool concept.
Okay. Break it down for us.
Basically what it means is that we don't just passively receive knowledge like a sponge soaking up water.
Right.
We actually actively construct our knowledge through our experiences and interactions with the world.
So it's almost like we're all little scientists from the moment we're born.
Yep, exactly.
We're testing things out.
We're figuring things out.
And what I think is so fascinating is that Piaget based a lot of his theories on just watching his own kids.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like his own little research subjects.
That's amazing.
Right there at home. And those observations led to his famous stages of cognitive development, which, completely changed how we see children's thinking.
I mean, before Piaget, a lot of people just thought of kids as like mini adults.
Right. Just smaller.
Yeah. But he showed that their thought processes are actually totally different and that they evolve in these distinct stages.
So, give me an example.
Okay. So in the first couple of years, babies are all about exploring the world through their senses.
Right.
Touching things, putting things in their mouths.
Yeah.
And moving around using their motor skills.
And then as they get a little bit older.
Yeah. Then they start to use symbols and language. But their thinking is still very concrete at that point.
So they're not quite ready for, abstract concepts like justice or infinity.
Exactly. It's not until adolescence that they start to really develop that capacity to think abstractly and reason hypothetically.
Wow.
So it's an incredible journey that our minds go through.
It makes you wonder what he would think about today's kids, glued to their screens and absorbing information in such a different way.
It's a whole different world.
It is. But speaking of a whole different world, let's shift gears for a second and dive into the world of Freud.
Okay, yes. Right.
So by the 1920s, his ideas were everywhere, but not always in the way that he intended. This is where we get into Freudianism.
Okay.
Which is basically all these different interpretations and applications of his theories that started popping up all over the globe.
So it's like he planted this seed, and then it grew into this massive forest of ideas.
Right, with branches going everywhere.
Exactly, like branches shooting up in all these different directions. And suddenly, psychoanalysis wasn't this fringe movement anymore.
Right.
It was being debated in universities, in art circles, even in politics.
Wow, that's a big reach.
It really was.
So it seems like he kind of unleashed something that maybe he couldn't fully control.
I think that's a really good way to put it.
Okay, so who are some of these key figures in this Freudian forest, as we're calling it?
Well, there's Freud's own daughter who really focused on the ego and how it develops in children.
Okay.
And she kind of shifted the focus away from purely sexual drives, which was a big departure from her father's work.
Right.
Which was really all about those instincts.
Right. So she was kind of going in her own direction a little bit.
Absolutely. And then you have Melanie Klein, who delved deep into early childhood and this fascinating concept called object relations.
Okay, object relations. What's that all about? I mean, it sounds a little technical.
I know it does sound a little jargony, but basically it's about how our early relationships, especially with our primary caregivers, really shape our inner world and our expectations in later relationships.
Oh, interesting.
So you can think of it like those early bonds create a kind of template for how we relate to others throughout our lives.
So, like, if you had a really secure, loving relationship with your parents early on, you're more likely to have healthy relationships as an adult.
Exactly. That's the idea.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So who else is shaping these Freudian branches?
Well, we also have Sandor Ferenczi, who emphasized the importance of the actual therapeutic relationship between the analyst and the patient.
Okay.
So he was really a pioneer in emphasizing empathy and emotional attunement in therapy, which is still hugely influential today.
Yeah, I can see how that would be important.
And then, of course, there's Karen Horney, who really challenged the very male-centric view of psychoanalysis.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of her. Wasn't she one of the first to kind of critique that whole penis envy idea?
Yes, exactly. She argued that women's psychology wasn't defined by this envy of men, but by societal and cultural factors that limited their opportunities.
Right.
And really shaped their experiences.
Yeah, so she was really paving the way for feminist psychology.
Right, absolutely.
Wow, so it seems like this Freudian forest was full of diverse perspectives and even some healthy debate.
Oh, absolutely. This era was a hotbed of arguments about things like the Oedipus complex, the universality of psychological concepts, and the role of culture.
Which are all still being debated today.
Exactly. It's amazing to see how those debates are still going strong.
Right, and it just shows how these ideas weren't just, abstract theories. They had real-world implications sparking social and political change.
For sure. It's like Freud threw a rock in a pond, and the ripples are still spreading.
Wow, that's a great analogy. Okay, but, while all this was happening in Europe, a completely different storm was brewing across the Atlantic with John B. Watson and his radical behaviorism.
Oh, yes, and Watson.
Now, he was a real game changer, wasn't he?
He really was. I mean, he basically declared that psychology should only concern itself with observable behavior, not with the mind or consciousness.
Okay.
Which he considered to be too subjective and unscientific.
So he was like, forget all that internal stuff.
Exactly. Let's focus on what we can actually see and measure.
He sounds like a bit of a rebel.
He definitely was shaking things up in the psychology world.
Yeah, and he's famous for this incredibly bold statement, right?
Yeah.
Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist. I might select doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a statement.
So he's basically saying that nurture or environment is more powerful than nature or our innate abilities.
Precisely, he believed that we are products of our environment and that our personalities are largely shaped by learning and conditioning.
Oh, okay, so how does that work?
Well, he drew heavily on the principles of classical conditioning, which Pavlov had demonstrated with his dogs.
Ah, yes, the whole Pavlov's dogs thing.
Exactly.
Where the dogs learn to associate the sound of a bell with food, and they start salivating just at the sound of the bell.
Exactly.
Right, so he's saying that a similar process is happening in humans all the time, even with more complex emotions like fear.
Right, and he even tried to prove this with his famous, though ethically controversial, Little Albert experiment.
Yeah, remind me about that one.
So he basically conditioned a baby to be afraid of a white rat by pairing it with a loud, scary noise.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember that now.
And while we certainly wouldn't condone such an experiment today, it did demonstrate how powerfully conditioning can shape our emotional responses.
It really makes you think how much of our own behavior is shaped by conditioning that we're not even aware of.
Right. It's a fascinating question. I mean, are we all just walking around responding to bells that we don't even hear?
That is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. So we've got these three very different schools, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, and they're all trying to unravel the mysteries of the human mind.
It's like they're all holding up different lenses and seeing something completely unique.
And yet, despite their differences, they were all united by this common goal.
Absolutely. Like they were all explorers setting out to chart this uncharted territory, but using different maps and tools.
And their journeys, though different, all contributed to our understanding of this incredibly complex landscape.
And those legacies are still being debated today.
It's a reminder that psychology is an ever-evolving field, always searching for new answers to these big questions about who we are and why we do the things we do.
It's an ongoing exploration, a constant process of discovery and refinement.
And it's really fascinating to see how these early pioneers shaped the field and set the stage for all the discoveries that came after.
Absolutely. Their work laid the foundation for modern psychology as we know it today.
So stay tuned, because in our next deep dive, we're going to explore some of the later developments in psychology and see how these early schools of thought influenced the theories and approaches that emerged in the decades that followed.
It's going to be a fascinating journey through the evolution of ideas.
So make sure to join us again next time for part 2 of our deep dive into the history of psychology.
We'll see you then.
See you go. So are we really just products of our environment like Watson seemed to believe? Or is there something more to us, some kind of inner drive or innate quality that shapes who we become?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that psychologists are still wrestling with today. But I think Watson's work really did force the field to take a hard look at the power of learning and experience,
Right.
It's like he was saying, hey, don't underestimate the influence of your surroundings on shaping who you are.
It's pretty wild when you think about how these three schools, European functionalism, Freudianism, and behaviorism, were all kind of bubbling up around the same time, offering these completely different views of the human mind.
It really is. It's like each one was holding up a different lens and seeing something totally unique.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting is they weren't totally isolated, There was this cross-pollination of ideas, debate, even personal connections between some of these big thinkers.
Oh, absolutely. It was a time of such incredible intellectual energy in psychology, like a giant laboratory of ideas.
So it wasn't just these separate schools off doing their own thing. There was actual conversation and exchange happening.
Totally. Think of it like a lively dinner party where everyone's passionately arguing their theories, challenging each other's assumptions, maybe even stealing a few ideas from across the table.
I love that image. It makes it feel so much more dynamic and human.
It really does. It's like we're witnessing the birth of modern psychology with all its different branches and approaches right before our eyes.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's just do a quick recap of the key takeaways from each school, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Sounds good. Let's solidify those puzzle pieces.
Exactly. Okay, so starting with European functionalism, their big focus was on the development of mental processes across the lifespan, right?
Right. They really emphasized how the mind adapts to its environment, with Claparède and Piaget leading the charge.
Right. Claparède with his idea of need being like the driving force, and then Piaget with his groundbreaking stages of cognitive development. They really changed how we think about how kids think and learn.
Yeah, they were basically saying, hey, kids aren't just mini adults,
Right.
They experience and understand the world in their own unique way.
Okay, what about Freudianism?
Ah, yes. So Freudianism really burst onto the scene in the 1920s. But remember, it's not just about Freud himself. It's more like a family tree with all these branches representing different interpretations of his ideas.
And those branches sometimes grew in some pretty unexpected directions, right?
They did.
Yeah.
And figures like Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, Sandra Ferenczi, and Karen Horney each brought something new to the table.
Yeah, it's important to remember that you can't just lump them all together under the same Freudian umbrella. They're all grappling with his legacy in their own unique ways, and that led to some pretty intense debates.
Oh, for sure. Like about the Oedipus complex, the role of culture, even the nature of female sexuality. These were hot topics back then.
And they still are today.
Exactly. Okay, and finally we have John B. Watson and his radical behaviorism.
Mister, let's focus on what we can see.
Exactly. He was all about making psychology and objective science focused only on observable behavior.
And he really believed that environment trumps everything you're born with.
Right. He was convinced that who we are is shaped by what we learn and how we're conditioned by our experiences.
And his little Albert experiment, while ethically problematic, definitely got people thinking about the power of conditioning.
It really did. It raised all these questions about how much of our behavior is learned even if we're not aware of it.
Like we're all just puppets dancing to strings we can't see.
It's a fascinating and maybe even a little unsettling thought, isn't it?
Okay, so we've got these three distinct schools, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, all trying to crack the code of the human mind.
And what's amazing is that despite their differences, they were all united by this shared desire to understand what makes us tick.
Yeah, like they were all explorers setting off to map this uncharted territory, but using different tools and strategies.
And their journeys, although different, all contributed to our understanding of this incredibly complex and fascinating landscape.
And their legacies are still felt today.
Well, absolutely. It's a reminder that psychology is constantly evolving, always searching for new and better answers to the fundamental questions about who we are and why we do the things we do.
Okay, so as we wrap things up here, we want to leave you with a final thought-provoking question to consider.
Of the three schools we've explored, European functionalism, Freudianism, and behaviorism, which one resonates most with you? And why? We encourage you to delve deeper into these ideas to explore their strengths and weaknesses, and to consider how they might inform your own understanding of the human mind.
It's like we've given you a taste of three delicious meals, and now you get to choose which one you want to go back for seconds on.
Or maybe you're like me and you want to try a little bit of everything. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to pick just one. These schools aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. It's not an either-or situation.
Exactly. Many psychologists today draw inspiration from multiple perspectives, weaving together different threads to create a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding.
It's like having a toolbox full of different tools. You wouldn't use a hammer for every job, right?
Exactly. Sometimes you need a screwdriver, sometimes a wrench. It's about finding the right tool for the task at hand.
Okay, so as we think about these different tools and approaches, it's also important to remember the historical context,
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine the world back then, world wars, revolutions, the rise of new ideologies. It was a time of incredible upheaval and uncertainty.
It really was. And these weren't just academics sitting in ivory towers, They were living through these tumultuous times, and those experiences undoubtedly shaped their views.
So their ideas weren't just theoretical. They were forged in the fires of real-world events.
Exactly. They were trying to make sense of the world around them to find some order and meaning amidst the chaos.
And that search for answers led them down these different paths, each offering a unique perspective on the human condition.
It's a journey that never really ends. And we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, given you a taste of the richness and complexity of psychological thought.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deeper into the fascinating world of the human mind. Thanks for joining us on this adventure.
Yeah, it's like we've laid out this big buffet of ideas.
It's a buffet of brains.
And now it's up to you to decide, what you want to dig into more.
Yeah. Or maybe you're like me. A little bit of everything.
Yeah, sample it all.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the beauty of it, right? You don't have to pick just one.
Right.
These they aren't mutually exclusive,
Right, like it's not an either or.
Yeah. A lot of psychologists today draw on multiple perspectives. They blend these different ideas together.
Yeah, to get a fuller picture.
Yeah, to create a more nuanced and complete understanding.
It's like having a toolbox, right?
Exactly.
You wouldn't just use a hammer for every job.
You got your screwdriver and your wrench, the right tool for the right job. But I think it's also really important to keep in mind, the historical context when we're thinking about all these different theories and approaches.
For sure.
I mean, imagine the world back then, world wars, revolutions, new ideologies popping up everywhere.
So much change.
Right. It was a time of just incredible upheaval and uncertainty.
Absolutely. And these weren't, just academics kind of theorizing in a vacuum.
Right.
These were real people living through some pretty intense times.
And you have to think that shaped their views somehow.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
I think those experiences, those historical events really influenced how they saw the world and how they understood human nature.
So it wasn't just these, abstract ideas floating around.
Right.
They were really wrestling with, the big questions of their time.
Yeah, trying to make sense of it all,
Right.
Trying to find meaning amidst the chaos.
And that search led them down these different paths, each offering a unique perspective on what it means to be human.
It's a journey that never really ends, I don't think.
That's true. And we hope that our little deep dive here has at least, piqued your curiosity.
Yeah, giving you a taste.
Given you a taste of just how rich and complex the world of psychology is.
It really is fascinating.
So keep questioning, keep exploring,
Keep that curiosity alive.
Yeah, and keep diving deeper into the amazing world of the human mind.
It's an incredible journey.
It really is. Thanks for coming along with us.
Thanks for listening, everyone.